Hey, good morning. So, what are we talking about today? All right, President Obama. Any questions over the readings? All right, you guys ready to go? All right, so what is the Affordable Care Act?
It's also the Obamacare.
Okay, it's Obamacare. What's the goal?
To make it more affordable for everybody and accessible to everybody.
To make what more affordable and accessible?
The health.
Okay, healthcare. All right. So the goal is to make healthcare available for everybody in the U.S., right? And so, say it again.
And cheaper for everybody, like that don't have.
Okay. It will.
It's affordable.
Yeah. It can't actually be cheaper and available, but yes,
Okay.
it's. So what happens is more people pay more money, but we'll get to that. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's to get healthcare to everybody in the U.S. So, all right. We talked about the election of 2008 last time, right? Okay, a couple people are remembering. All right, what is the first thing that President Obama does? He earns the Nobel Prize. Why does he earn the Nobel Prize? The Nobel Committee actually says he earned the Nobel Prize by being elected president because he gave people hope. So we've had two presidents, I believe, that got the Nobel Prize. One was Teddy Roosevelt, who was one of the most aggressive people that we know. And the other is President Obama, who got the prize because he was expected to do something. And so why wait until he does something to get the prize? Let's go ahead and give him the prize now. And so a lot of people believe that he got the prize because he was not President George W. Bush. But his first goal is to remove all of the troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that realistic? Okay, not at this point. Because if you remember, while we are focused on Iraq, what's happening in Afghanistan? The Taliban is resurging. They are growing in power, growing in their strength around the country. Who is still hanging out, we find later, in Pakistan? Osama bin Laden. All right. So have we accomplished either of the goals in Afghanistan that we set for ourselves? No. So we go ahead and go back into Afghanistan. We surge in Afghanistan. During this time, we do find Osama bin Laden. Amazingly enough, he is in Pakistan. So we go in to arrest him. When we go in to arrest him, he is killed. Now, the interesting thing of this, when we kill him, we bury him at sea. Anybody know why we buried him at sea?
No country would bury him.
Okay, so intriguingly, there were countries that would have buried them on their property. But there are two things. One is kind of, hey, we've got to make sure this doesn't create more opportunities. So if you bury a man that has created a terrorist organization from a religious ideology, and you bury him, you could create a shrine where people would go and become terrorists, right? So we don't want to do anything that could possibly create new terrorists. And so that's one of the major reasons given. The other major reason is if you are Muslim and you are buried in water, the belief is that you can never go to heaven. So they bury him at sea so that there's, it is a statement to say this guy is a terrorist, and so, he's not going to go to heaven anyway, but now there's no shot for him. All right. We do go ahead and withdraw troops from Iraq. The bad part is, as we're withdrawing the troops, the situation in Iraq is getting worse and worse. So we withdraw troops in 2011, but by 2013 we return the troops because now you have Al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS that are growing there. All right, the Arab Spring. So what is the Arab Spring about? Anybody know? How does that come about?
Social media.
Okay, so a lot of young people throughout the Arab nations, for the most part, North Africa and in the Middle East are frustrated by leadership that has been dictators or monarchs or people who have absolute authority. And they're saying, we don't want that. Now they are having the ability to see other opportunities, other ways of doing business. And so they say, wait a minute, we want a government more like the Western governments. We want democracy. And so what you see is a bunch of people who use social media to contact each other. And basically, it's flash mobs with the purpose of overthrowing the government. And so you have people who are getting together to protest and say, hey, this government is unfair and inappropriate, and we need to have more voice from the people. Tunisia actually works. They get a more democratic government. In many other places, one of two things happens. The government presses down on the people and makes their life a little more difficult, or maybe gives them some extra rights but maintains a firm grip on the government. Or like in Libya, in Syria, they actually go into full-scale civil war with the people fighting against the government. Now, the difficulty of this is when you have people trying to gain democracy, if they don't already have it, if there's not already an established movement toward democracy, then you have oligarchs, you have powerful people who don't want to give up authority, right? So if you have people who don't want to give up authority, the only way to change this power is war. And so this is when you start to see a lot of civil wars, and a lot of them the U.S. gets involved with. We're going to talk about that. The Syria becomes a civil war. The leader of Syria says, you guys are not going to tell me what to do. I am going to take control. He starts to use pretty harsh tactics against his own people. And so President Obama says, you know what? We're drawing a red line. We're drawing a line in the sand that says, if you use chemical or other agents against your own people, then we will overthrow you. A year later, a year and a day actually, the Syrian leadership uses sarin against their own people. Now, by this time, there's a problem because Russia has gotten involved on the side of the Syrian leaders, and everything is kind of crazy. The rebels that are trying to overthrow the government have been joined by Muslim terrorists, and so the U.S. is in a position of trying to say, we support the rebels, we don't want to fight Russia, so we're not going to overthrow the government, but we also want to be really careful not to support the terrorists. And so Obama is forced to pull back on his red line and basically say, okay, you guys did it, we're not happy, but we're not going to do anything about it. You also have the Libyan civil war. In Libya, the U.S. says, we're going to go in and we're going to help the rebels. We don't want the rebels defeated by Gaddafi, but we don't want to put troops on the ground. So if you don't want to put troops on the ground and you want to support the rebels, what do you have to do?
Air support.
Yeah, air support. And so what we do is we roll in with NATO and the U.S. The U.S. starts, and then we hand off to NATO really quickly because we're already in conflicts and have been in conflicts for years against Muslim people. So we don't want it to look like it's a war on the U.S. against Muslims. And so we say, look, NATO, we need you guys to take the lead in this. And so NATO kind of takes the lead. The UN says, we don't want anybody on the ground messing with things. So there's no discussion between the people on the ground and the people who are in the air. The problem with this is we finally kill Gaddafi, the rebels kill Gaddafi, and we don't know who has the the plan on the ground. And what actually occurs is there's like 4 different plans. So instead of resolving the situation in Libya, now we have created a civil war. A couple years later, September 11th, the Libyans decide that they are going to attack the U.S. embassy. The embassy reduces the number of people in the embassy, sort of like we did in Iran. And we say, okay, we're going to let most of the people go, but we're going to retain the embassy here. And on September the 11th, the embassy is attacked. The ambassador and 3 American citizens are killed. And immediately the Obama administration blames a video, the innocence of Muslims. And they say it's because of Christians that the embassy was attacked. Over time, they start looking into it and they find out, no, this was a well-planned attack by terrorists who had planned it on September 11th for the anniversary of the initial attack. So Libya does not work well. Libya, in fact, is still an ungoverned state. It is in a civil war right now. And because it's in an ungoverned state, ISIS and other terrorist groups have been able to grow there. All right, what about domestically? His main thing is the healthcare reform or the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, right? So how long have people been trying to get affordable healthcare for Americans? Anybody know? This starts under Franklin Roosevelt, back during the Depression. And so they finally are able to push through the healthcare reform. This does extend healthcare to 32 million people, but it costs money. And so almost a half of those people who did not have healthcare before still don't have healthcare, except now under the Obamacare, they actually have to pay what the Supreme Court deems is not a tax, but they have to pay a fine with their taxes for not having health care. Does that make sense? All right. So it does increase the number of people who have health care. The other problem was that everyone was promised, hey, you can keep your doctor if you want to. At the end of the day, rates went up pretty significantly, and most people, or many people, were not able to keep the plan that they had had before because of the changes in the programs. All right, he continues the bailout of the banks. In the military, he gets rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And he says, all right, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was it started under Clinton. There has plenty of time. You have 2 administrations under the Bush administration and 1.5 under Clinton. He's like, you have plenty of time to figure this out. So he goes ahead and says, gay people will be allowed in the military. At the same time, there is a push to bring transgendered people into the military. So they have moved on this area. So the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, what is that referring to? That was one of the questions, so hopefully you guys help me out.
The DREAM Act thing.
The DREAM Act, what does the DREAM Act say?
For undocumented immigrants to help them, if they
Okay.
came if they were brought into the U.S. before 16 years old.
Okay, so if you were brought to the U.S. and you were not 16 years old, if you did not go through the appropriate process, he says, well, it's not your fault. Someone else brought you, so we are going to not prosecute you. We are not going to remove you from the country. We will give you an opportunity to become a citizen. And so that continues through the Trump administration, and then the Trump administration said, all right, we're going to hold off on that. It is still a big, big issue because you have people on both sides who are trying to figure out what is the appropriate way to secure the border while being kind to people who are needing help. All right. The Supreme Court now upholds the immigration checks. So ICE, immigration, can come in and check someone to see if they are here illegally, but they cannot just remove them for being here illegally. The person would need to commit a different crime as well. So we have to increase the debt ceiling. Why are we increasing the debt ceiling? Someone's excited about that.
We're spending too much money.
Okay, we have spent so much money that we basically have reached our credit limit. And so now the problem is, if we don't increase our credit limit, if we don't increase the amount that we can borrow, then we will default on the loans. Does anybody know what happens when you default on a loan? If a person defaults on their loan, what happens?
They take the property or
Yeah.
send it to collection.
Yeah, they send you to collections. They can start the process to take back your property. The difficulty is, with a country, can you really take back their property? No. And so what then happens is the rates that you're allowed to borrow at go up pretty incredibly high. So the U.S. is like, well, we can't afford to do that. We can't afford to have higher interest rates for our money. So we just increase the debt ceiling. Again, this is really a big frustration for a lot of people. So you have the Tea Party and you have Occupy Wall Street. The Tea Party, anybody heard of the Tea Party? What is the Tea Party? What is the goal of the Tea Party? I'll give you a hint. They're really frustrated because we're spending so much money, right? They're saying we need to be economically secure. We need to go ahead and reduce our spending so that we are not having all this debt that our great-great-great-grandchildren are still going to be responsible for. We have to stop spending in a way that is really stupid. So they are primarily conservatives, and they are saying you guys need to stop spending money and try to have a balanced budget. Which is funny because if you remember, we passed the Gramm-Rudman law, right? And the Gramm-Rudman law says we will never spend more than we bring in. How often has that occurred? Almost never. We just violate the law because we take things off the books, and that way we say, oh, well, it's not the same. In addition to ticking off the conservatives, we also tick off the liberals. And the liberals said, why, and both sides actually said, why are we handing money to banks? Why are we handing money to big businesses that made stupid business decisions and not letting them just fall apart? Why don't we have them go bankrupt instead of the U.S. go bankrupt? And so Occupy Wall Street tries to occupy in the New York area. They occupy a park and they go by and they try to shut down businesses that got loads and loads of money from the U.S. So even though we do increase the debt ceiling, it really frustrates people from both sides. Now, sadly, does that have any impact on the real world? No, because at the end of the day, we elect the same people who still spend loads and loads of money without regard to what that's going to do to the future. All right, so in 2012, is Obama liked? Yeah. Many people still like President Obama. The Republicans nominate a guy named Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney is a very, very centrist Republican. And so a lot of people are frustrated by that. They're like, well, you know, why are we not moving farther to the right? The Democrats are moving further to the left. So the Republicans hit, hey, we're in a recession, we were attacked overseas, we're not really making a strong statement, we're not doing a lot in terms of overseas leadership. We are the leader of the world, and yet it really doesn't matter. And they say, look, we did pass the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and a lot of people are no longer able to afford their health care because it increased the costs so much. The Democrats talked about, we've removed the troops from Afghanistan, we have killed Osama bin Laden now, and that Romney is so wealthy that he's really out of touch with most U.S. citizens. So at the end of the day, Obama wins a second term resoundingly. Soon after, you have the WikiLeaks. There is a young man who is a contractor for NSA. He uses his access to computers to gain access to different collection systems and the data that's collected from those systems. He decides that the U.S. is wrong because we are conducting intelligence on our allies, and that he doesn't think we should do that. Now, the problem I have with that is I have worked in that system, and our allies are all conducting intelligence on us. It is not necessarily to use in a war, it's to find out what are they thinking, are they going to be with us in areas, how do we move forward, how do we team best. So he passes all this out. He is sentenced to 35 years because this is treason. But President Obama says that he has already served 7 years. So he commutes his sentence to 7 years versus 35. Then we have Snowden. Anybody know who Snowden is? All right. Snowden is the same thing, right? He takes intelligence, he takes information, and he passes it out to other people. And he says, and in fact, I got these mixed up, I apologize. Manning is a military guy, a young enlisted guy, and Snowden is a contractor. So, Snowden passes the information out. He says this is because the U.S. is wrong, we're doing bad things. We look at it, and at the end of the day, one of the things that frustrates me is that with both of these people, there are means, if you think the U.S. is doing something bad, there are means to take your classified information to the appropriate people and say, hey, this is wrong. If you remember, there are 8 people in Congress that are authorized to see anything in the U.S., right? So at absolute worst case scenario, you can take it to one of those 8 people who is not in the leadership or is not in the party that is running things at the time. And you can say, hey, I believe this is wrong, and allow them to look at it and allow them to say, you're right, we need to fix this, and they can fix it without it going outside to other countries. But there is also the Inspector General program. There's various ways that you can resolve this. But both these guys chose not to resolve it in-house, but to hand out all sorts of collection information to the rest of the world. So, again, some people say, hey, they were doing the right thing. Anybody know where Snowden is right now?
Russia.
Yeah, he's in Russia. Why? Because he gave the Russians a lot of information that they are using against us right now, and so they gave him Russian citizenship. In 2013, we have the creation of ISIS, and this means we have to return into Iraq to help the country defeat the new terrorist organization that we helped create. In 2014, Russia annexes Crimea. So, what is the background of this? Anybody know? All right. Years and years and years ago, like centuries ago. Ukraine has the first prince, and it's pretty funny because my son had to explain this to me, but the prince of the Ukraine is the first leader that the Russians claim. Now the Ukrainians claim, no, he's not Russian, he's Ukrainian, he just controlled Russia, parts of Russia, and so there's some fighting over that. But this is the way, the Black Sea is the way that the Russians have a port that will open onto a warm body of water. All of their other ports are iced up in the winter. So it's really important for Russia to have an area where they can come down and they can have ships down in this area. The difficulty is, while they were the Soviet Union, the Ukraine is part of Russia, right? Or it's part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapses, Ukraine actually separates from the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union is really frustrated by this. Russia is really frustrated by this. They are even more frustrated because of a lot of the countries that they took over during World War II now want to be part of NATO. Why would they want to be part of NATO? What is NATO? What is the purpose of NATO? Protection of these countries against Russia. Do they have any reason to feel like that they would not be protected?
They used to be part of the Soviet Union.
Okay, they were forcibly made part of the Soviet Union. So all of these countries have a very valid reason to say, wow, this big country who is next to us took us over and forced us to have the government that they wanted for decades, and we tried to overthrow it, and every time we tried to overthrow it, they killed us. Right? So it's a reasonable concern that they don't want to be part of Russia. However, a lot of the Russians have moved into Crimea, have moved into these areas because of trade, and over decades of time, they are now part of the Soviet Union. So people move back and forth between the Soviet Union and Ukraine and some of the other countries. So now you have large Russian-speaking majorities or minorities in these areas. So all of a sudden, Putin, who, by the way, anybody know Putin's background? Putin was a KGB agent in East Germany when the Soviet Union fell. So what is his mindset? If you think about it, if you're a KGB agent, are you really, really pro-communism? Yes. I mean, does everybody know who the KGB is? It's like their internal police organization. But this is the group that makes people scared of police. Like, there are people in the US that are concerned about the police, but we have laws and we have lawyers. The KGB is an organization that basically can come into your house, arrest you, and you disappear the rest of your life. Your family, if they ever mention you again, they're potentially arrested. So it's interesting that Putin really believed that everyone loved the Soviet Union. Now, that makes sense, right? He works for the organization that if you tell them you don't love the Soviet Union, they arrest you and you go sit in the gulag for 50 years. So nobody's going to tell him the truth. Nobody's going to tell him, hey, we really don't like you guys. So the first time he understands how people really feel is when the Soviet Union collapses and the East Germans are running through the streets cheering because they have overthrown communism, and then they go ahead and they go into the KGB building. He actually has to run out the back of the building to escape because they're going to burn the building down, right? So he is very frustrated. He wants to go back to a Soviet Union where Russia is powerful, where Russia controls different areas, and he thinks that this is the overwhelming, like what it should be. So in the U.S., if you remember, we had this manifest destiny, right? Where we are going to take over all of what is now the U.S. He believes the same thing. He believes that there is a manifest destiny for Russia to control Eastern Europe. And much of Eastern Europe is not in agreement with that. They're not happy with him. So what happens is they have people in Crimea that are Russian speaking. He says the people in Crimea that are Russian speaking are being treated badly. That the government that came in overthrew the Russian speaking leadership, the Russian supporting leadership, and is now supporting the West. In fact, they want to be part of NATO. Now, if you are Russia and there is a NATO country right here, what does that do to your access to the warm water port? It really makes that difficult, right? And so the Russians say, you know what? The Crimean people have asked us to come in, and so they send in, we called them the little green men. They were guys who were explicitly not Russian soldiers. Now it was amazing because many of them had been Russian soldiers up until the day before they rolled into Ukraine. But they did not wear Russian uniforms. They were trained military personnel with Russian military equipment who came into the Ukraine and helped in the civil war that no one knew existed, right? Why do you think that these guys would come into Ukraine? As soon as they take over Ukraine, the Crimea says, you know what, we're going to have an election. The election is run by the Russians, and Crimea votes to become part of Russia. Now, what happens to all the Ukrainian people in Crimea who don't want to be part of this? They are basically told, sit down, shut up, you're going to do this, right? So this is exactly what occurred after World War II occurring again, right? So sadly, what does the U.S. do? Nothing. It's exactly what we did with Romania, Eastern Germany. Every time when someone tries to overthrow the U.S. or the USSR, we're like, okay, sorry, not our problem. When the Russians come down and they take over, we're like, well, we're not really sure if it's the Russian government because it could just be these Russian people. Well, okay, the fact that they were all Russian military beforehand and they all decided to take vacation days to go down to a conflict seems a little crazy, right? But they go ahead and the Russians annex Crimea into Russia. Then Obama decides he wants to open relationship with Cuba. So, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Okay, it depends on what side of, what you're looking for. The positive is now we can sell things to Cuba. The negative is Castro has done really, really horrible things to people for decades, ever since he got into office. They have put people into prison for disagreeing with the government. They have executed people for disagreeing with the government. So a lot of Cuban refugees who came to the U.S. when Castro came back are saying, this is horrible, why would you ever do this? But we open up diplomatic relations with Cuba, and I believe we still have open relationships with them. So if you wanted to go down to Cuba for a vacation, you could now go down. We also work on the Iran nuclear deal. So we start out, why do we not want Iran to have nuclear weapons? Okay, I mean, these are the people that shouted death to America over and over and over, right? So they're not super good friends with the U.S. They also hate Israel. And they have said that they will destroy Israel and blow it off the map. So if they have a nuclear weapon, then they have a good shot at doing that. Finally, they are huge supporters of terrorism. So remember when I said that my leadership wanted me to find the tie between Saddam Hussein and the terrorists, and we said we couldn't do it? Anybody know what the tie is between Iran and terrorists? Osama bin Laden's family, including his eldest son, were living in Iran when we attacked Iraq. Why is this different? Because their leader is a Muslim religious leader. Now, the interesting piece is he's a Shiite, and the Osama bin Laden was a Sunni. So you would think that they would not agree, but they have a lot that they have said, you know what, you're against the West, we're against the West, we're just going to go ahead and do this. And so, and when you have a religious leader, he's not concerned about having another religious leader because his authority is just as strong. So we are concerned that the Iranians are trying to create a nuclear weapon. The first thing we do is called Stuxnet. Has anybody heard of Stuxnet? So, this is old, and I feel bad even, talking about it because this was super, super new and exciting when we did it. Have you guys seen thumb drives? All right. You still use thumb drives? Okay. I know the school doesn't. You can't use any thumb drives in this school now. But you can put any virus or anything you want to on a thumb drive, right? And then people put it in a computer. Now, the bad part is people are willing to, hey, there's a thumb drive, let's just stick it in the computer. And we actually proved that again because we've done it a few times. And if you dump a whole lot of thumb drives into the parking lot, I will guarantee you that 10 students will pick up a thumb drive and stick it in the computer.
You're talking about those little tiny things that you...
Yeah. Yep. Because it's like, oh, well, who does this belong to? What's on this? And so they will just stick it in the computer. If you put a virus into that thumb drive, it can automatically start working as soon as you put the thumb drive into the computer. And now your computer has a virus. So what do you think we did when we found out that the Iranians were building nuclear capability that would give them the ability to build a nuclear warhead?
Put a bunch of viruses on thumb drives and dumped them in Iraq.
We put a whole bunch of viruses on thumb drives and then dropped them off in the parking lot where all of the scientists went. Guess what the scientists did?
Picked up the thumb drives and put them in their computers.
They picked up the thumb drives, they put them in their computers, and what it did is actually make the system that created the nuclear capability mess up. And it was a randomized problem. So the Iranians could never say, okay, when it does this, when it gets to this point, it's going to have a problem, right? Because it's random. No one knows when it will break. No one knows how it will break. It will just break. And so months and months go by, and they're like, wow, every time we get close, the system breaks down, and we have to start over. And so this goes on for a long time. For some reason, when it comes out, there are a lot of people who say, you know what, the coding on this virus looks very much like US and Israeli coding. So the way that US and Israeli computer scientists write code. And so President Obama finally admits, yes, we're the ones that did it. We broke the Iranians' nuclear system. And so now a lot of people are like, well, how do we get them to stop? And the Iranians say, look, if you will stop having sanctions on us, then we will stop moving forward as quickly toward nuclear weapons. Now, this again creates a real fight between people who are like, the Iranians are just lying to you, and the people going, well, this is our only shot, right? And so this moves into the Biden era. But they go ahead and they lift the sanctions, and the Iranians promise not to create nuclear weapons for at least 10 years. And so this moves on for a little bit until the Trump administration. All right, what about domestically? Anybody know anything about Sandy Hook? All right, it's a school shooting. And this is when you start to see a rise in school shootings. They have Columbine, but there's not a huge number, right? In Sandy Hook, this is kind of different. Like Columbine is in a high school. It is a high school person who is angry with people who treated him badly, and so I am going to kill the people that treated me badly, and other people get in the way, then I will shoot them. In Sandy Hook, you have someone who just decides, I want to make a name for myself, and the other school shooters got a lot of notoriety. They got on the news. I will get in the news. I will kill a bunch of first graders. So I'm not trying to say that the people in Columbine deserve to get killed, but at least I can understand why someone would say, oh, somebody was mean to me, I'm angry, and I'm going to hurt them, right? What did these first graders do to anybody? As far as we know, there's nothing that caused this other than the guy decided, I want to be on the news and I want people to recognize who I am. So he went and killed a bunch of the first graders. All right. The next thing that comes out is kind of a scandal. The IRS has started looking into conservative organizations that are trying to get tax exempt status. And if you are supporting Democratic areas, like things that the Democratic Party supports, then you get your access to tax exempt status. But if you are supporting what Republicans like, then they start to do a lot more investigations, and a lot of these organizations do not get their tax exempt status. And so all of a sudden there's some checking into why are we doing things, why is the IRS playing political games instead of giving everyone the same shot at doing things. All right, Ferguson. What happens in Ferguson?
There are riots.
Okay, there are riots. Anybody know why?
Police were trying to arrest a African American, and it ended in him losing his life.
Yes. So there's an African American man who has, the police believe have been engaged in attacks in stores. And so they go to arrest him. There is a confrontation. And the only thing we know for sure is at some point the young African American man had his hand inside the police car and had attempted to take the gun of the policeman. He is backing off, and then the police say he is moving forward again, and they shoot him. He's a large man, and so they say they were scared for their lives, but he was unarmed. And so this is when you start to see Black Lives Matter. You start to see why are people, why are police killing unarmed black men? And so this creates a riot. It creates throughout the U.S. There's a lot of problems, and the African American community says we have to get people to stop shooting unarmed African men, no matter what the reasoning is. And so this is kind of that push, the beginning of Black Lives Matter, the beginning of the push against police, and we should go ahead and cut funding to the police and come up with different ways to respond, right? All right, the Freedom Act. Anybody know about the Freedom Act? All right, we'll start back. What is the Patriot Act? Anybody know? All right. Under the Bush administration, the Patriot Act says we have terrorist problems. We have handcuffed our intelligence community so that they can't help and they can't, they're not able to accomplish what they need to do. So they go ahead and give access to things like the phones. The phone companies keep records of who you call, how long the call is, and information like that, right? So I find it amusing. The U.S. government is not allowed to keep that information. Now, the Patriot Act says, hey, if the company has kept this information, then we can go and get that information from the company without going through a lot of processes. Now, you still have to get a warrant. If there's not time for a warrant, then you can get emergency access, but you have to go back and get the warrant. If you wind up, if this is terrorism, you can stop the terrorist act. You cannot put someone in prison based on information gathered without a warrant. But it expands the capability of the intelligence community greatly. And so now the Freedom Act, a lot of people were saying, hey, the Patriot Act has moved too wide. We need to cut the ability of the government to get into our lives. And so we reduce it, but the Freedom Act continues several of the things from the Patriot Act that allow us to stop terrorism. All right, so Obergefell versus Hodges. What is this?
Trial for gay marriage.
All right, so as we've talked about, gay marriage is illegal, right? Is it illegal in the U.S. anymore? No, because you had Massachusetts and other states who have declared it to be legal. Now you have people who can be legally married in one state but move to a different state and they are no longer married, right? So some of the problems created from this, if I get married to someone and I move to a state that does not recognize my marriage, can I be divorced? No, because legally in that state I am not married. The other thing is, what happens if one of the partners in the union dies? If you're living in a state where the marriage is not recognized, then they say, wait a minute, is the will legal? Well, if there's a will, then it's obviously legal. If there's not a will, does the spouse get to have half of everything? Do they get to take everything? And it creates a lot of problems because in one state something is legal, in another state it's not, right? So this gets taken to the Supreme Court and they say, is it legal for people to be married who are of the same sex? And the Supreme Court comes back and says yes. If you want to be married, then you can be married, whether you're, the differing sexes or the same sex. And so this now allows gay marriage. And
In every state?
yes. So if the Supreme Court says it, then it is true across the nation, because now it's a federal decision. So now, yes, if you are gay, you can be married in any country or any state in any area, and it is going to be recognized. All right, the last thing that happens is kind of intriguing. It shows the political dissension in the U.S. Anybody know who Merrick Garland is? Okay, we got one person. You guys need to grow up and learn things. I know you weren't old enough to probably care. That's one of the things I realized this year. How old were you guys when, 2016? 14, okay. So, yeah, I mean, for the Obama administration, you guys didn't really, it was like, yeah, he's the president, but I don't think you were engaged in a lot of the details of what happened. So, President Obama, a Supreme Court justice died, and I feel bad because I don't remember who it was. And President Obama gets to nominate the next Supreme Court justice, right? So he nominates Merrick Garland. He puts the nomination forward. What is the process to get the Supreme Court person in position?
Something with Congress?
You have to go through the Senate. It has to, all of the nominations have to go through the Senate and be approved. So he nominated Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland's name goes to Congress, and the leaders of Congress decide, you know what, there's only like 6 months left, so we are not going to look at it. Now, I have to say, I think this was illegal. I think had President Obama wanted to push the issue, he could have forced the issue to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would have said, if there's a nomination, you have to address the nomination. Because at the end of the day, the process is the process, a nomination and then the selection. If the Supreme Court does not want Merrick Garland, then all they have to do is vote him down, right? But instead, they choose not to allow him to compete. Now, why would they do that?
Trying to win the next election.
Because they think that they're going to win the next election. They think they have a really good shot at winning the next election, and then they can put in a Republican nominee. And actually, what happens? Exactly that. The Republicans win the next election. They then put a different nominee forward, and that nominee is accepted by the Senate and put into position. Merrick Garland is left out. Now Merrick Garland is the Attorney General for the U.S. Because he's obviously not a Supreme Court justice. Now, the bad part is, if this is the new standard, if this is the, all right, you only have a certain amount of time, and then, you know, you're kind of a lame duck, so you don't get to make nominations, then that should be true all the time, right? Under Trump, what is the last person that is nominated? Who is the last person that's nominated?
Amy Coney Barrett.
Amy Coney Barrett. How long before Trump is out of office? Do you remember?
2 months.
Yeah, it's like 2 or 3 months. So the problem I have is, if you're going to make a standard, then the standard should be the standard. You shouldn't say, under one administration, you have to have them 6 months early. In the next administration, it's fine to have them 3 months early. So this is kind of an embarrassment for the U.S. because, again, we play political games and we don't just do the process correctly. All right. So in 2016, the Democrats nominate Hillary Clinton. Now, a lot of people say Hillary Clinton is the first woman nominated to be the president of the U.S. Is that correct? No. There have been numerous women nominated to be the president of the U.S. by various parties. What makes Hillary Clinton unique?
She's married to Bill Clinton.
Yes, well, she is married to a former president, which is very unique. It's never happened that a president's spouse has been put into the White House. The other thing is, she is the first woman put forward as a presidential candidate, as the presidential candidate from either of the two main parties, the Democrats or the Republicans, right? So that's why this is different. She's the first person who had a real shot as a woman at becoming president. The previous people have been put up, but not by major parties. So she is selected over Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders really frustrates her. He says, okay, I actually care about people. You're just caring about the rich people. So there's a lot of baggage that she is carrying from previous elections, right? The Republicans grabbed Donald Trump. Why do the Republicans pick Donald Trump?
Become a politician.
Yes, he says, I'm not a politician. He is a wealthy guy who went to Hollywood and, got lots of notoriety for saying you're fired. But he is boisterous. He is like, hey, I'm going to tell it like it is. He calls people names. He's really obnoxious. And because he's so obnoxious, the media highlights him all the way through. And I personally think, and this is just my personal opinion, that the media wanted to have Hillary Clinton elected, and so they thought, we'll put this buffoon up who is always making statements, always saying things, and it's going to look bad, and so he'll be the candidate. What actually occurs is people are like, you know what, I like this guy. He is not Hillary Clinton. He doesn't have all this political baggage. He doesn't have all this stuff behind him that people are like, wait, what is going on? Now, I will give you, he did have a lot of questionable business ethical things. So they both have a lot of ethical problems. In fact, this is the first time in U.S. history that I am aware of that the FBI had ongoing investigations into both presidential candidates. Both of the presidential candidates had done things that people believe are illegal, were illegal, and the FBI was investigating both political candidates for office. Now, I personally think that we need to come up with a new law or something that says, hey, if the FBI is investigating you and the investigation looks like you're a criminal, maybe we should tell you you shouldn't run. But the American people get to vote for who they want to vote for. And if we want to vote for criminals, if we want to vote for people that are being investigated, then we have the right to do so. So the campaigns, Republicans say, hey, we got to get rid of corruption. And Hillary Clinton is the epitome of corruption, this insider Washington person who does things that are questionable. The Democrats say, hey, Trump is dangerous. He's unfit for office. He doesn't act presidential. He's kind of, he's just off the map, right? So the other piece that's really interesting in this, and this is something I want to highlight, in the 2016 election, and I would believe that in previous elections, the Russians are super engaged. Now, some people say that the Russians are supporting Trump. I will say, from my background, from everything I saw, what the Russians were doing is destabilizing the U.S. So the people that are extreme on the left, they make more extreme. The people that are extreme on the right, they make more extreme. So they try to make sure that centrist candidates are not going to be electable. So why would you want to do that?
To cause controversy?
Yes, to cause conflict. If I can convince people in the U.S. that the electoral system is broken, that it does not work, then I can destroy democracy, right? And the Russians, why would the Russians want to destroy democracy? Why would the Russians want the U.S. to fight each other? Because we are the world power, and if they can take us down, then yes, China and Russia, being communist powers, can take over and influence the world. And so they're like, we want to take the U.S. out. The best way to take the U.S. out is by forcing us to hate each other. And so what you see then in social media, where everybody talks about echo chambers, what do you think those echo chambers are? What do you think we're seeing? So my wife's on Facebook, and I think it's pretty amazing. She refuses to have any political conversations on Facebook, ever. And so she has friends who are very, very staunch Democrats. She has friends who are very, very staunch Republicans. And it's amazing to me that they're like, you know, I had this person, they didn't agree with everything I say, so I am shutting them out. I have unfriended them. I'm not going to have any conversation with them, right? What happens with the news media? If you look, it's amazing to me because I actually try to hit media on both sides. And they will actually ignore stories that don't match with the agenda that they want, right? And I'm not saying one side or the other. I'm saying both sides work very hard to ignore stories that don't fit with the agenda that they want. And so the Russians have piled into that, and they are trying to ensure that nobody can talk to each other. Because if we hate each other more than we hate them, then they can destroy our influence in the US, they can destroy our influence in the world, and then they gain the influences that we lose, right? So there's an incredible amount of Russian influence, and I would believe China as well. I think China just does it more effectively. All right, as I said, the FBI is investigating both candidates, and intriguingly, again, and this is, I say it always frustrates me, the media calls the election almost before the election happened. If you notice, all of the pundits were saying, yeah, Hillary Clinton has won this, it's guaranteed, it's Hillary's election. And then when the election happened, what actually occurred? Trump won. And so there was a lot of, what happened? Why aren't people, doing what we expected them to do? I will say, I think a lot of that is the polls. How you ask a question depends on what answer you get. And I recognized that I actually did that one time. I was in the middle of a poll, and the pollster was asking questions in a certain manner that it was obvious what they wanted me to say. So I didn't want to make them angry. I didn't want to frustrate them, and I was telling them what they wanted to hear. And all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, why am I lying about stuff? I've never met this person. I will never see them again. I really don't care what they think about me. So I went back and I was like, hey, wait. We got to start over. And they said, what do you mean we got to start over? And I said, well, you're asking questions that led me to certain answers, but that's not what I really believe. And the guy was like, what? I said, yes, your questions are forcing people to move to certain answers, but if you don't like my answers, that's fine, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I actually believe. And then he had a whole lot of problem because, he's like, well, we can't go back and we can't. I'm like, okay, well, then I don't need to finish this poll. But the pollsters would move to have a certain answer. And so what happens is now you had an election that kind of flipped. And that's why pollsters, if you notice, every election from now on, pollsters are like, okay, how do we do this? How do we figure this out, right? All right. So, actually, let's go through for the questions for today. What is the Affordable Care Act?
Obamacare.
Obamacare, health care, expanding health care to other people, right? What is the Arab Awakening?
We're young Arabs who are trying to get their tyrannical government out of.
Yes. So a lot of Arab countries, the younger people for the most part are using social media to get more human rights and more rights for themselves. What is the DREAM Act and what are the unexpected consequences?
Undocumented immigrants.
Okay.
get the opportunity to get citizenship.
Okay, so people who came to the U.S., who were brought to the U.S. under 16 that did not go through the appropriate processes are allowed the opportunity to become U.S. citizens, right? All right, so for next class, do you want to have a quiz? This is your quiz if we want to have the quiz. It will just give you a chance to have an extra grade.
Perfect.
So I got 1 yes, 2, 3, okay. We'll go ahead and do a quiz next class. Then what we will do, I want you guys to come to class, and you could actually bring in your answer because it's not like, you know, you're not going to know it ahead of time. I want you to think through what has happened since the Obama administration, so since the election of Trump, in your life that you think will be in the textbook 50 years from now. Does that make sense?
So since Obama,
Since the Trump election, what has occurred, and I will say you can look at outside stuff if it has an impact on the U.S. But I would like you to focus on U.S. history because this is a U.S. history class, right? And so presumably everybody's going to recognize things like COVID. So you can throw that in there, but I would like you to consider what are some other things that have happened. I want you guys to actually sit down and look and say, hey, what kinds of events have happened? What things have occurred since I have been old enough to been watching that will impact not only my life, but the lives of people, 50 years from now.
can we write them on the paper and bring it to
Yes.
or do you want us to write it in class?
No, go ahead and just bring it into class, and that will count as an extra quiz grade in case, there's something, if you missed one, it will just give you an extra grade. So please bring one in. If you don't have one, I will let you write one, but I want to make sure everybody that shows up gets credit for this, right? So, all right, any questions about that?
How long does it have to be? Just,
Like normal.
okay.
A couple of sentences. Hey, COVID-19 happened. We shut down schools. We shut down different things. Everybody was forced to wear a mask, right? All right. Are there any questions on the final exam?
What day is it going to be? 5th?
I will have to look that up.
I tried to look it up.
Check the syllabus. I did update the syllabus.
It says on the grade book and Blackboard that it's on the 5th.
Okay, so it would be on the 5th. So just make sure. What's that?
In here?
Yes, we will take it in the same place. You will have 2 hours to take the test. If you have a disability and you want to take it somewhere else, you can do so. I have never had anybody who did not finish it in the allotted time. It's exactly the same as the midterm, just different questions, right? So I think you guys should have no problem with it, but do however you need.
The syllabus says that it's on the 7th.
Okay.
Oh, on the 7th?
Yeah, but I don't know if that's right.
Yes. So there are two things. Look at the syllabus, or there is a schedule of tests. I will go back and I'll check the schedule, but it should be good. All right. Any other thoughts? All right. I will see you later.